Monkey D. Luffy is one of the most popular characters in anime, but One Piece hasn't always been the greatest when it comes to power scaling. However, Monkey D. Luffy is in a class of his own because from the powers of rubber comes this video, as we look at all of Monkey D. Luffy's gear form transformations. And to start off with, let's look at base Luffy, which is just normal Luffy with no haki, no nothing. Think of this as a young Luffy in Dawn Island that was constantly working on his gum pistol attack, because as we all know, Luffy has eaten a devil fruit known as the Gomu Gomu no Mi, and this has granted his body the powers of rubber. And one thing about rubber that some of my fellow nerds know is that it's not a conductor of electricity, but we'll get onto that in a second, because base Luffy can stretch any part of his body. I mean, we've seen him stretch out his arms to throw multiple punches like a jet Gatling, and we've seen him stretch his legs to extend his kicks. Funnily enough, we've even seen him stretch his neck back to perform a headbutt attack on his opponents, which is oh so creative. But that's not all we get from Luffy, because defensively, there's so much more. Being rubber basically means Luffy bounces straight back from regular attacks, which of course are not imbued with haki, but that's not all. Remember I said that rubber doesn't conduct electricity? Well, we saw that when Luffy came up against Enel and Skypiea. You see, this was still early One Piece, and Luffy was yet to learn any advanced techniques such as haki or even his gear form transformations. So honestly, this was completely a stroke of luck, because thanks to Luffy being rubber, he was the natural counter to Enel's lightning abilities, and therefore he was able to defeat him. But I'm not just going to downplay Luffy to just his rubber abilities, because outside of this, we've seen so much more from Luffy. We've seen Luffy have such drive and determination, which can technically be categorized under the word willpower. However, that's not all, because Luffy has displayed insane levels of strength, defeating monsters pre-time skip like Crocodile in base form. Now of course, I do have to caveat that, because Luffy defeating Crocodile all the way back then is absolutely insane when I think about it now. But I think it's something that leads on to my next point under base Luffy, which is just his creativity. You see, even with no haki or gears, Luffy was able to use his imagination and creativity to defeat his opponents, such as inhaling air or even water, to ultimately become Water Luffy and defeat Crocodile. But enough of base Luffy, because I want to touch on Gear 2. I mean, every One Piece fan was definitely fanboying or girling over this, because honestly the moment was so high, because this happened during the Enies Lobby arc, where the Straw Hats had found themselves in their toughest battles yet against the World Government Organization CP9, and this was to save their crewmate Nico Robin. With all the Straw Hats in their own battles, Luffy had to think of something that could compete against the strength, the speed and the agility of these OP government agents. So when Luffy finds himself against Bluno on the top of Enies Lobby, he finds a way to fight and compete by taking his own techniques to the next level. Now Luffy does this by increasing the speed of blood in his body, thanks to being rubber of course, allowing the blood and oxygen to pump throughout his body quicker, increasing all of his strength and speed, easily being able to keep up and surpass the defensive powers of the CP9 members. Now I know it all sounds cool, but when this technique was revealed, we found out that there was actually a side effect, in which would reduce Luffy's lifespan every time he used Gear 2. But as we all know, Luffy absolutely did not care about it, as his job was to get the job done. And he's continued to use Gear 2 over and over again, refining it more and more every time we see it. You see, as we get to Thriller Bark and Marineford, we see Luffy is able to use it even easier. He basically was able to just go into Gear 2 and then come out of it just as he wished, particularly in the Battle of the Best at Marineford. But let's not quite skip to Marineford, because Enies Lobby is literally one of my favorite arcs ever. And not only did we get Gear 2 here, but we also got the creativity of Gear 3 during this arc. I've mentioned Luffy's creativity, and oh how creative his Gear 3 was. Now Luffy's first Gear 3 was actually to open the gates of justice, but we'll come on to that in a moment, because the first time that us as readers and watchers actually get to see Gear 3 is in his fight against Rob Lucci. And I know I keep talking about Luffy's devil fruit, but listen, pre-time skip Luffy was so creative and so reliant on his fruit, because Gear 2 used his rubber ability to increase his blood flow within his body, but Gear 3 required Luffy to blow massive amounts of air into his thumb that it became balloon-like, making the bones of that part of his body literally turn huge. This inflated the part of the body that Luffy wanted to go on to inflict huge amounts of damage, being able to destroy large buildings weapons with ease, and even being able to land an insane giant pistol on Rob Lucci. But that's not all, because although that was the most impressive Gear 3 at that point, the first time he actually uses it was to destroy the gates of justice, and ultimately we learned that Luffy would once again have a side effect on this technique. You see, Gear 2 was destroying Luffy's lifespan, but with Gear 3, Luffy would shrink to the size of a child and ultimately not be able to fight until his body would return to normal. But just as Luffy learned to control Gear 2 as the story progressed, we also see Luffy learn to control Gear 3 as he started using it sparingly in fights, using it momentarily before going back into Gear 2 or his base form. Now Luffy is really creative, and I've said this over and over and over again, but with Gear 4 comes Bound Man, or Bounce Man, because after the events of Marineford, Luffy spent 2 years training with Rayleigh, and although not for the whole time, he indeed finally learned the art of Haki. And during the Dressrosa arc, in the midst of battle against Don Flamingo and fire surrounding them, Luffy coats his arm in Haki, kicks off his sandals, blows into his arms almost like Gear 3, he inflates his muscles, and the majority of his body is covered in Haki to reveal to us this new form, Gear 4, Bounce Man, where the Haki on his rubber skin makes him bounce all the time. But in turn, Luffy has become insanely powerful. His offensive blows, his defense, Luffy's speed has become notably quicker too. It's absolutely crazy, because in his battle against Don Flamingo, Gear 4 was the complete equalizer to Dofi's string attacks. Dofi really didn't want to see these problems from Luffy. Luffy's speed basically gave him flying abilities, but what was insane to me was that his body was still able to have the capabilities of rubber. Luffy was basically OP to me here. He was overpowering Dofi, and the sheer size of Luffy was generating so much power. And since we're talking about power, do you know what else generates a lot of power? Tanks. And I totally set myself up for that, because no sooner than later, we find out that Gear 4 has multiple forms. And the second form of Gear 4 just so happens to be called Tank Man. And once again, Luffy uses his fruit, and that's what makes him exceptional. Because the ability for his body to stretch, his stomach to stretch, and his crazy metabolism means that Luffy was able to eat a ton of food, stuff his face, to the point of his stomach exploding. Okay, maybe not literally, but have you ever ate so much that you feel so stuffed and your stomach hurts? Well, that's how big Luffy got, because since his stomach is rubber, it literally just stretched out. And with Luffy eating so much and getting so big, his defense was crazy. He literally was tanking shots from Cracker in the Whole Cake Island arc. And Cracker is no scrub. He was the third commander of the Big Mom Pirates, by the way. So that's no small feat. Now, what I love about Tank Man is that even though Luffy looks goofy and loses so much of his speed, he's able to tank these shots and literally use the recoil of his body to blast Cracker away. Once again, showing the unique ways that Luffy uses his fruit and just how creative he can be. Because look, if this is Luffy's slow form, we must also find out that Luffy also has a fast form. Because once again, during the Whole Cake Island arc, in his intense battle against Katakuri, who, as a side note, is one of my favorite characters in One Piece, Luffy finds himself unable to even get close to Katakuri. Katakuri's ability to see into the future meant that Luffy was always one step behind, and ultimately just too slow. So what do we get? We get the reveal of Luffy's Gear 4, Snake Man. Just like Luffy's other Gear 4 techniques, he sees himself coated in Haki, but this time is much slimmer. And this time, in this form, Luffy is solely focused on speed. And I guess that's just the genius of Luffy, because if you can't hit someone because you're too slow, then why not just speed up? Now, what's even better is that Luffy's punches are erratic. He literally would change the direction of his punches in a moment's notice, that he himself had no idea where his punches would go, meaning that not even Katakuri could predict where Luffy's punches would land. And honestly, even with a godlike ability of seeing into the future wasn't enough to stop the godlike ability of Luffy's punches, which you can't predict. That is just completely insane. And since we're talking about godlike abilities, we absolutely have to talk about the last form of this video. And that's Luffy's Gear 5th, Sun God Nika. And this is the one that caught me completely off guard, because the common theme of Luffy throughout the story had been his reliance on his devil fruit, which we knew to be rubber. And Luffy just finding finding new and different ways to make rubber absolutely awesome. But Gear 5 has taken Luffy's ability to some place nobody could have ever imagined. You see, the concept of awakenings had been explained to us through Dofi with his string, and then Katakuri with his mochi, but no one could have ever predicted that Luffy's Gear 5 would be his awakening, let alone turning him to a complete god. This form is the epitome of freedom. Luffy's creativity is his only limitation. You see, what we once thought to be one of the 3 base devil fruits, a paramecia fruit at that, actually wasn't what we thought. Luffy has in fact eaten a mythical zone fruit, the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika. And this fruit actually gives Luffy the characteristics of zones and also paramecias. And dare I even say it, whatever the heck he wants. Luffy has ultimate freedom, and throughout the story we've seen Luffy's childlike character and his willingness to just be free, and it appears that this has finally aligned with his fruit to give us this absolutely amazing awakening. Which I'm not gonna lie, I was so hyped when this was revealed in his battle against Kaido. And of course we know that whenever Luffy uses his fruit at first, it always has some sort of side effect, in which we actually did see some extreme aging once he used it. But who cares? Because we always find out that Luffy finds a way to overcome this. So what's next? Gear 6? Maybe Gear 7? I don't know. But one thing I can say is that if there's a new gear, I will be there. Peace out.